Xiaolin had always believed that the greatest gift a man could possess was the ability to see the world clearly. At least, that's what the pamphlet said when he signed up for the experimental procedure that would restore his vision. The latest in retinal implant technology, they called it. What they didn't tell him was that what he would gain wasn't just sight. It was a revelation, a curse, an overwhelming bombardment of everything a human being was never meant to understand, and it all started with a flash. The day he regained his sight, he was in a sterile white room, lying back on a cold examination table, a pair of sleek, surgical goggles covering his face. The doctors had assured him it would be painless, a simple procedure that would restore his ability to see after 5 years of living in darkness. The lights above him flickered once, twice, and then there was a sudden pop in his brain like the flicking of a switch, and there it was. It wasn't the bright white of the fluorescent lights overhead or the sterile, plain walls that startled him. No. It was the aura. Xiaolin blinked, his eyes wide open. Every object in the room had a glowing outline, an eerie pulse of light. The walls shimmered with a soft blue light, the doctor's lab coats radiated white, almost blindingly so. But it was the people that shocked him the most. The doctors, assistants, everyone who was standing around him had an almost ethereal quality. The color of their auras shifted and swirled like fire and ice, ebbing and flowing in a rhythm he couldn't quite grasp, and then there was the feeling. A kind of heat, deep within his chest, as if the universe had just connected a wire directly to his soul. He was seeing things he'd never imagined. His heart raced, pumping faster than ever, his mind struggling to make sense of it. What the hell is this? The doctor, he smiled kindly, his face a mask of professional confidence. It's normal to feel a little overwhelmed at first. Your retinal implant is allowing you to see more than the visible spectrum. You're picking up on the energy fields of living organisms. Energy fields? Xiaolin muttered, trying to process what he was hearing. Like auras? Doctor, he nodded, his smile broadening. Exactly. But it's much more than that. These energy fields reveal a lot about a person, their health, their emotional state, even their life force. With time, you'll get used to it. Used to it? Xiaolin didn't think he'd ever get used to this. He'd wanted to be able to see again, to witness the world in full color. But this? This was madness. The way everything radiated alive, vibrant, and yet somehow alien made him dizzy. 3 months later, Xiaolin was still adjusting to his new sight, though adjusting felt like the understatement of the century. The world, he'd come to learn, was not just a collection of physical things that could be touched and measured. It was an endless sea of energy. People weren't just people, they were glowing, shifting, writhing balls of life, pulsing with energy, life forces that could be read, understood, and even predicted. Every moment of every day, Xiaolin was assaulted by a wall of color and motion, a constant reminder that there was more to the world than he'd ever imagined. His neighbors were particularly troubling. Mrs. Yu, who lived across the hall, had a gentle, lavender aura that suggested she was sick, very sick, in fact, and yet no one could tell from her physical appearance. Xiaolin could see the dim, flickering light of her energy field, slowly dying. He tried to ignore it at first, but it gnawed at him, like a whisper in his ear that wouldn't go away. Then, there was Mr. Tao on the second floor, a businessman who looked perfectly healthy, but whose aura fluctuated like a flag caught in a gust of wind. One minute it was bright and steady, the next it was chaotic and trembling. Every time he crossed Xiaolin's path in the hallway, the sense of impending doom hovered in the air, as if he were a clock ticking down to something inevitable. And yet, the worst part wasn't seeing their auras. It was what he began to realize. He could predict death. At first, it was subtle, a brief flicker in someone's energy field, a deepening shadow that hinted at illness. But as the days passed, the signs grew stronger. He began to recognize the patterns, energy fields that wilted, that flickered, that faded. He could see the exact moment someone was going to die, even before their body gave any indication of the inevitable point. One evening, after a long day at his new office job, a call center for a tech company that sold overpriced smart devices, Xiaolin had come home exhausted. He needed a break from the world, but when he opened his apartment door, there was something waiting for him, the unmistakable thrum of an unfamiliar energy field. Standing in his living room, bathed in soft golden light, was a man he didn't recognize. He was tall, with a face that was both too young and too old at the same time, like someone who had lived through centuries and somehow refused to show the wear of time. The man's presence radiated an unnatural calm, like someone who had found a way to exist outside the flow of time itself. "Who are you?" Xiaolin asked, his voice trembling. The man didn't answer immediately. Instead, he studied Xiaolin with a look that suggested he was appraising something more than just the physical body standing in front of him. "I've been watching you," the man said finally. His voice was smooth, as if every word had been carefully crafted. "You can see it, can't you? The energy. The life force." Xiaolin's pulse quickened. "What do you want?" "My name is Wei Zhen." He stepped closer, his aura rippling like water disturbed by a stone. "And I need your help." Xiaolin instinctively took a step back. The man's aura was wrong. It wasn't just different. It was static, like a perfect, unshifting force that existed outside the natural ebb and flow of life. Wei Zhen's energy was unbroken, smooth, and absolute. Xiaolin's throat tightened. "What do you mean, need my help? I don't know what you're talking about." Wei Zhen smiled, and Xiaolin felt a strange knot form in his stomach. "I know what you've been seeing, Xiaolin. I know you can predict when someone is going to die." Xiaolin said nothing, his mind racing. "Most people can't see it, you know. The energy. But you're special. You have a gift. And I need you to understand something." Wei Zhen's smile faded, and his aura seemed to pulse stronger. "What you're seeing, these people, their auras, their lives, none of it is an accident. There are people who have learned to control their energy fields, to manipulate them. And through this manipulation, we have found a way to escape the inevitable." Xiaolin stared at him, heart hammering in his chest. "Escape the inevitable?" The words echoed in his mind like a terrible mantra. Wei Zhen's energy field shimmered, and for a moment, it seemed as if the room itself was holding its breath. "We've found a way to cheat death, Xiaolin. To live forever. And I need your help to finish what we've started." Xiaolin's heart thudded in his chest, a dull, aching rhythm that seemed to echo in the silence of his apartment. Wei Zhen's words hung in the air, thick and heavy. Escape death. Live forever. The implications were impossible to ignore, even as his mind scrambled to make sense of them. He stared at the man in front of him, this stranger who radiated calm like a dark, impenetrable force. The way his energy field pulsed with such unnatural steadiness, like a machine that had no need of repair, was both fascinating and terrifying. It made Xiaolin feel small, fragile, like a leaf in the middle of a storm. "What are you talking about?" Xiaolin finally managed to say, his voice tight. "You're telling me that you can't die?" Wei Zhen smiled, but there was no warmth in it. Only a cold certainty. "Not exactly. Not in the way you understand it. We've learned to manipulate the energy around us, to control the flow of life force. It's not about immortality in the traditional sense. It's about control. Control over the very thing that gives life its meaning." Xiaolin's mind reeled. He had seen death in its many forms. The flickers of a dying aura, the dimming of light that marked the end of someone's life, the way their energy would slow down and break apart, as if it were a candle burning to the wick. He had seen people die before, but the idea of controlling that, of bending the rules of nature itself, he couldn't wrap his head around it. "How?" was all he could manage to ask. Wei Zhen stepped forward, his aura swirling around him like smoke. "It's a process. One that requires precision, knowledge, and resources. And that's where you come in, Xiaolin." Xiaolin took a step back, his pulse quickening. "I don't know anything about this. I just see things. I can't help you." "You're wrong," Wei Zhen said, his voice a low murmur that seemed to reverberate with power. You've been seeing things for months, Xiaolin. You've been watching the energy fields, watching how they fluctuate. You can see when someone's life is nearing its end. What if I told you that what you see isn't just an observation? What if I told you it's a tool? A key? Xiaolin swallowed hard. He wanted to reject this whole thing, to shut Wei Zhen out, to escape the horror of it. But the pull of curiosity was too strong. It gnawed at him, a quiet whisper that he couldn't ignore. What if he could understand it? What if he could control it, too? No one can control life and death, Xiaolin said, though he didn't believe it himself. The things he'd seen with his new vision, people's auras, the way they moved, how they shifted and changed, it felt like a language, one he could almost understand, if only he could decode it. Wei Zhen's smile deepened. That's where you're wrong. We've learned, Xiaolin. We've learned how to manipulate our own energy, to extend our life by taking from others. Xiaolin's stomach twisted. Taking from others, he repeated, his voice a whisper. The idea of draining someone's life force, of feeding off another person's energy to sustain your own, it was monstrous. It felt like something out of a nightmare, something he shouldn't be hearing, let alone considering, but Wei Zhen's aura didn't flicker or falter. It stayed steady, unwavering. It's not a matter of morality, Xiaolin. It's survival. We are at the top of the chain, and we've learned how to feed from those beneath us. The weak, the sick, the dying, their life force is a resource to be harvested. The words hit Xiaolin like a punch to the gut. His breath caught in his chest. He had always been a little cynical, a little detached from the world around him, but this was something else. It wasn't just the manipulation of energy, it was the exploitation of life itself. You're talking about draining people? Xiaolin asked, his voice trembling. He didn't want to believe it. He couldn't. Wei Zhen nodded, the faintest glimmer of satisfaction in his eyes. Yes. We take what is ours. It's an elegant process, really. The energy field of a person is finite like a battery. Once it's depleted, they die. And their energy feeds those who know how to harness it. I can see it in you, Xiaolin. You have the potential to understand it. To do it. Xiaolin's mind whirled. He felt like he was drowning, caught between the allure of knowledge and the horror of what it meant. He had always thought of death as a natural part of life, something inevitable, something to be accepted. But this? This was an abomination. I don't want to be a part of this, he said, his voice firm now. I don't want anything to do with you or your plan. Wei Zhen didn't flinch. He didn't even look surprised. His energy field seemed to shimmer for a moment, and then he took a step forward, closing the distance between them. You don't have a choice, Xiaolin. You're already a part of it. Your ability to see the energy fields is a gift, one that could be used for far more than just observing. You can help us. Xiaolin shook his head, backing away from Wei Zhen. I'm not helping you. I don't care how much you think I can see, I'm not going to help you drain people's lives. Wei Zhen's eyes hardened. You'll change your mind. I'm patient. I can wait. He turned to leave, his aura shifting with a slow, deliberate grace, like the calm before a storm. But remember this, Xiaolin. You are the key to unlocking what we've worked for all these years. Whether you help us or not, we will find a way to use your gift. There's no escaping this. The door clicked shut behind him, and for a long moment, Xiaolin just stood there, his breath shallow, his heart pounding in his chest. He hadn't wanted to get involved in this. He hadn't asked for these abilities, hadn't wanted to see what he saw. But now, he was tied to something bigger, something darker, and he couldn't escape it. The energy fields still pulsed around him, more vivid now than ever. He could feel their pull, the way they reached out to him, calling him to understand them, to harness them, to control them. And with every beat of his heart, Xiaolin realized just how dangerously close he was to crossing a line he could never come back from. Xiaolin spent the next few days in a haze, trying to shake the feeling that he was being hunted not physically, but psychologically. Wei Zhen's words haunted him, lodged in his mind like a splinter that refused to be removed. The idea of manipulating energy, of controlling life forces, it felt like a sickness, a temptation that could not be ignored. He tried to push it out of his thoughts, but every time he closed his eyes, he saw the energy fields around him flickering, pulsing, changing. He could see it now. He could feel it. It wasn't just the auras of people he could see. It was the energy of everything. The way plants grew, how animals moved, even the objects in his apartment, they all had their own energy signatures, their own life force. It was dizzying. At times, it was beautiful, like 1,000 different constellations swirling in the dark sky, but it was also terrifying. Every moment felt like walking through a maze that could collapse at any second. On the third day after Wei Zhen's visit, Xiaolin received a call. It was an unknown number, but something inside him told him to pick up. "Xiaolin," said a voice on the other end. It was calm, controlled, too controlled. The voice of someone who had been watching, waiting. "We need to talk." It was Wei Zhen. Xiaolin's blood ran cold. "I don't have anything to say to you." "Oh, but you do," Wei Zhen replied smoothly. "You see, Xiaolin, we've been keeping an eye on you. You're in deeper than you think. Your abilities are far more valuable than you realize. We've already made arrangements to ensure your cooperation." Xiaolin felt his throat tighten, his breath shallow. "What do you want from me?" "Nothing. Not yet. But you will understand soon. You're part of something much larger now, Xiaolin. And I'm giving you one last chance to decide. Help us, and you'll be rewarded. Refuse, and," there was a pause, "you'll be out of options." Xiaolin hung up the phone without saying another word, his mind racing. He had no more time to waste. Wei Zhen and his people were serious. If Xiaolin didn't act soon, he'd be trapped in their web forever. It was time to make a choice. The silence in Xiaolin's apartment felt oppressive, thick as fog. He stood there, staring at the phone in his hand, his finger still hovering above the end call button. He had made his decision. At least, that's what he told himself. He couldn't allow Wei Zhen and his strange, sinister group to manipulate him, to pull him deeper into their scheme of stealing life forces. He didn't want any part of it. Not now. Not ever, but the pull, the undeniable temptation of the power that his gift held kept gnawing at the edges of his mind. It was like an itch beneath his skin, and no matter how hard he tried to ignore it, it wouldn't go away. The more he thought about it, the more it became clear, he could see it. He could control it. Xiaolin shook his head, as if trying to dislodge the thought physically. It wasn't that simple. This was wrong. What Wei Zhen had proposed, it wasn't just dangerous, it was monstrous. People's lives weren't commodities, to be harvested for someone else's gain, but what if it wasn't just about harvesting life force? What if there was something more to this? Something he could control for the better? The very fact that his ability to see the energy fields was growing stronger, more precise by the day, unsettled him. He knew he was walking a tightrope between being able to control the energy around him and being consumed by it. The next few days passed in a blur of conflicting emotions. Xiaolin had never been a particularly trusting person, but what Wei Zhen had said kept echoing in his mind. The energy. The potential. The promise of mastery over life itself. The sheer arrogance of thinking that he could control such a power, the very thought of it made him feel both invincible and utterly powerless. That night, as Xiaolin sat alone in his apartment, he felt the weight of the decision before him. Wei Zhen had warned him that he didn't have a choice, that the path had already been set. But even with that knowledge, Xiaolin wasn't sure how to act. How could he reject something that had such profound implications? What if he could use his ability for good? Could he? His phone rang again. The caller ID showed an unknown number, but this time, Xiaolin didn't hesitate. He answered the call immediately, his hand trembling. "Xiaolin," Wei Zhen's voice greeted him, smooth as ever. There was no warmth in it, but there was a distinct finality to it. I told you I would be waiting. Your decision is inevitable. Xiaolin took a deep breath, his mind racing. I don't want any part of this, Wei Zhen. Wei Zhen chuckled softly, the sound barely audible but carrying an unmistakable edge. You already have, Xiaolin. You don't understand yet. But you will. You see, this isn't just about taking from others. It's about creating something greater. We're on the verge of something extraordinary. And you're the missing piece. Stop it, Xiaolin snapped, his patience thinning. You think you can manipulate me into doing whatever you want just because you know I can see these energy fields? You think I'll just... You will, Wei Zhen interrupted, his voice suddenly hard, the calmness gone. Because you already see the truth. You know what your gift means. You felt it. You felt the power coursing through you. Xiaolin's throat tightened. He had felt it. More than once, the energy fields around him had resonated with something deep inside him, something ancient, primal. It was as if his body had been designed to understand this force, to absorb it, to manipulate it. And yet, every instinct screamed at him that it wasn't right, that it wasn't the way the world was meant to be. Do you want to live forever, Xiaolin? Wei Zhen asked, and the question was so casual, so confident, it sent a shiver down Xiaolin's spine. Do you want to become something more than human? Xiaolin's thoughts flashed to Mrs. Yu, her fragile, flickering aura. To Mr. Tao, whose energy fluctuated dangerously, teetering on the edge of life and death. He had seen it all, watched as life ebbed away, knowing it was only a matter of time. He had felt the power of his ability, the raw force of life, the inevitability of death. And now, here was Wei Zhen, offering him a way to transcend it all, but at what cost? I won't be a part of your game, Xiaolin said firmly, his voice unwavering. I won't help you steal lives. I won't help you cheat death. Wei Zhen was silent for a long moment, as if he were weighing Xiaolin's words. When he spoke again, his tone was colder than before, like the distant crack of ice forming in a frozen lake. You don't have a choice, Xiaolin, Wei Zhen said. You think you can resist the pull forever. But you can't. Once you see the energy, once you understand its flow, it becomes a part of you. You are already bound to it. There's no going back. And when you realize that, you'll come to us. You'll have no other choice. Xiaolin's pulse raced. The words didn't scare him, they made him angry. He wasn't some pawn in a game he didn't understand. He refused to be manipulated. He refused to believe that the only way forward was to give in to this madness. He hung up the phone with a force that rattled his bones, his hand shaking as he set it down on the table. He stood in the middle of his apartment, breathing hard, the air thick with tension. He had to act now. He couldn't keep sitting back, waiting for Wei Zhen to pull him deeper into his world of manipulation and deceit. His mind flashed to the one person he hadn't yet considered, Mrs. Yu. The woman whose aura had been flickering for months, growing weaker by the day. He knew what would happen if he didn't intervene. He had seen the signs, felt the energy slowing, dimming. And yet, he hadn't done anything. Now, he had to decide. Could he live with the knowledge that he had the power to help her if only he could control it? Could he save her without becoming the very thing Wei Zhen wanted him to be? Xiaolin made up his mind. The next morning, he went to Mrs. Yu's apartment. She opened the door with a faint smile, but Xiaolin could see the exhaustion in her eyes, the shadow of pain that lingered just beneath the surface of her carefully maintained composure. Her energy field was weak, pulsing weakly like a candle flickering in a strong wind. Xiaolin, she greeted him softly. What brings you by? I've come to help you, he said, and there was no hesitation in his voice. He could see her aura more clearly now, the way it wavered, strained against the inevitable end. Her body was still alive, but her energy, her life force was slipping away. Her eyes widened slightly. Help me? What are you talking about? I can see your energy, Mrs. Yu. I know what's happening. You're sick, and your time is running out. But I can stop it. I can." He stopped himself, catching the words before they spilled out, unsure of what he was even saying. He wasn't sure if he was lying or telling the truth. "You can." Her voice held a note of disbelief, but there was a flicker of hope in her eyes, a desperation that tore at him. He stepped closer, his hands shaking slightly, unsure of what he was about to do. But as he looked at her, the pulsing glow of her aura growing fainter with each passing second, he knew that he couldn't let her die, not like this, not when he had the power to intervene. "I can help you, Mrs. You. But it's not just about extending your life. It's about controlling the energy, your energy. If I can stabilize it, I can. I can keep you alive longer. I can make you strong again." The look in her eyes was almost too much to bear. Trust. Hope. A desperate plea for survival. Xiaolin's chest tightened, his mind racing. He had seen the energy fields shift, he had seen the patterns that led to death, but this was different. He wasn't just predicting it anymore, he was acting on it. He reached out, his hand hovering above her, trying to connect with the energy field that surrounded her. He could feel it, the gentle pulse of her life force, the ebb and flow of energy that kept her alive, but it was fragile. So fragile, and then, it happened. His hand hovered over her aura, and a strange sensation surged through him like an electric current running through his body. The pull was immediate, irresistible. And for a moment, he thought he could feel her life force, as if it were his own. He closed his eyes, focused, and then he felt the warmth of her aura suddenly swell. The fragile light flickered back to life, but something was wrong. Xiaolin's heart slammed in his chest as he felt the surge of energy shift. It wasn't just Mrs. Yu's energy anymore, it was his, too. And in that moment, Xiaolin understood. He understood what Wei Zhen had meant. He understood the cost of manipulating life force. He had crossed a line.